Did you know that the forgotten founder of Zionism went on to play a leading role in Agudas Yisrael, or that Rav Chatzkel Abramsky was responsible for the continued presence of the Muslim Waqf on Har HaBayis? It turns out that the margins of history tell the real story. Behind the Times dives into the big concepts and overlooked moments that carry vast meaning, all through the lens of Torah and rabbinic thought. Behind the Times, with Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Galinsky and Gedalia Gutentag. The year was 586 BCE, or the final months before Churban Bayis Rishon. Jewish sovereignty in Eretz Yisrael, battered by the Babylonian invasion, was approaching its end. The great cities of Yehuda had fallen one by one. The roads were in enemy hands. The kingdom had shrunk to a handful of isolated strongholds. According to Sefer Yirmiyahu, by that stage, only the fortified cities of Yerushalayim, Lachish, and Azekah still remained. And then there were two. At Lachish, the great fortress of the Shfela, perched high above the valleys and roads that linked the coast to the Judean hills, men watched the horizon. Somewhere beyond those hills stood Azekah, or at least it had stood. The defenders of Yehuda had an ancient system of communication. Signal fires. As long as Azekah stood, its fires could be seen from Lachish. The commander of Lachish scanned the horizon. No signal, no fire. And at some point during those final terrible weeks, an officer in Lachish sat down and scratched out a few words onto a broken piece of pottery. Words that would lie buried in the earth for more than 2,500 years. Ki el masois Lachish anachnu shomrim k'chol ha'osas asher nosan Adoni ki lo nira es Azekah. We are watching for the signals of Lachish, he wrote, according to all the signs which my Lord has given us, for we can no longer see Azekah. My dear Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Galinsky, those are some of the most dramatic words, surely among the most dramatic findings in the archaeology of Eretz Yisrael. And why are they directly connected to Shiva Asar B'Tammuz that we're about to experience?
First of all, Gedalia, I want to thank you so much for getting me interested into the story of Lachish. I read a lot throughout my life, and I heard the name Lachish from time to time, but I never realized the scope of what Lachish is. And when we continue talking today, the listeners will realize that as well. But in any case, this is a testimony of the path that will lead Nevuchsdnezzar to Yerushalayim. And that's why, Chazal say regarding learning Torah, Yitzayir bala shmuel lefonav.
Person should imagine when you're learning.
I feel that the reason why you have to imagine the person teaching is because you have to have context. You have to understand who and when is relaying the information. If you don't know that Tosfos comes after Rashi or Marsha comes after Tosfos, you can't understand the flow of what you're learning.
You need to know the hierarchy.
Right. In history, it's the same thing. If you want to really understand what's going on and you want to feel it, and that's why it's so important in Shabbos and Talmud, because for us, it's a gigantic mush in our heads. We don't know what the flow of history is of Bayis Rishon.
Bayis Rishon is a problem, I feel, because Bayis Sheni, somehow, Romans, the local Europeans, we get them. But what happened in Bayis Rishon? What did the Babylonians want? That's one of the things that I feel is a difficulty.
And what's very fascinating is that the finds from Bayis Rishon are very rare. Not only that, written finds from Bayis Rishon are extremely rare.
Which makes these very important.
Exactly.
And what exactly were these? As they called them, the Lachish letters or Lachish ostraka. I think, if I'm not mistaken, they were shards of, as we said, shards of pottery
right,
that were found, buried in Lachish, and we're going to get to unravel what they were.
And where were they found? They were found like the entrance to town and the most strategic point of Lachish.
Yeah.
We'll get to that later on in Mitzvah.
I think what we're going to unravel in this episode is to perhaps get an insight into the possible story told by these broken bits of pottery. Because together they tell one of the most important and I think dramatic stories in Jewish history. The stories of the final days before Churban Bayis Rishon. And that story, Rabbi Ephraim, places Lachish at the center of the story. This is not just an opening hook. Rather, we're going to see that this fortress, where they found these shards of pottery, is going to be at the center of the story over here. Because by the time that these letters were scratched out, Lachish had already been for generations at the center of the story. And because we're going to explain what is so strategic about this particular location, Lachish. I'll finish this introduction with this on this note, which is that the story is very human because, as you say, we have very little evidence, written evidence, but this is so moving. You find something clearly written in these weeks leading up to the Churban, and I think you are going to introduce an element of doubt into the Hislavos, as you said before, of my getting carried away with this.
By the way, do you know how much in the market just one line of wording from Bayis Rishon sells on the market today?
Go on.
In the millions.
I mean, it must be priceless.
In the millions.
Can you imagine?
In the millions.
Every Rebbe's, walking stick from things is whatever it's worth. This is a line from Bayis Rishon.
Right.
As you said,
there's an office in Yerushalayim called the Antiquities Office, right?
Yeah.
Rishut Atikot. They go searching for every word that's written from that period. And I saw a documentary about it in Hebrew. And it talks like 5 million shekels or dollars. No matter what it is, but it's very...
millions of something. Millions of rubles. Anyway, so let's just finish this introduction just by saying, I think at the heart, for me, what we're about to discover here is that, well, as you say, that Bayis Rishon, the Churban Bayis Rishon is for us some type of mush, some type of just a mix. We don't know what it is. But when I'm looking through this, spend a significant time now looking through Sefer Yirmiyah and Melachim Beis, I see one thing which I've never heard said before, and which is that the story of the Churban, alongside of it being a story of hate, of sin, and of tshuva, and of Churban, and of a spiritual dimension, which we always focus on, fascinatingly, if you look through the Nevi'im, you see that at heart it's a geopolitical struggle involving three empires. Rabbi Ephraim, even thousands of years after its destruction, Lachish is an astonishing sight. I came across it a number of years ago, and as we do every so often in our family, we just set out and head for a new moshav to just explore. And if you go out of the back way of Ramat Beit Shemesh, you take a left, right leads to Yerushalayim. We took a left. Left lead goes down towards Kiryat Gat, and it's beautiful countryside immediately. Recommend the driver.
There's a long road which is called Kvish
38.
Right, it's a very long road that takes you practically from Yerushalayim until Gaza. You can reach Gaza.
Yeah, Gaza. So it's
I once went to interview someone in that area, and I was shocked about how close it is. How close
from Beit Shemesh. I've done this. The Gaza border is about 50 minutes away.
It's shocking.
50. So
it's just like one road,
yep.
And which is like the heart of the country, like from the extremes until Yerushalayim.
Yep. And if you go out of Beit Shemesh, take a left down towards Kiryat Gat, which is the direction of Gaza, you will, after about quarter of an hour, come to a junction, and you'll see a set of moshavim. And by the way, this is a particular part of the beautiful part of the country, which is grape-growing part of the country. People don't know. For those who live here in Israel, shop in the supermarkets over here. You can buy
in Lachish, right?
In Lachish, in Beitali, in Lachish.
This is even a catchy tune on
Correct.
the radio.
And at Moshav Lachish, we discovered. There it is. When actually saw the grape packing and distribution sorting center, and you drive through, it's the beginning of actually quite a few miles of uninterrupted vineyards that you don't really associate with Israel. Maybe you associate that with the Golan or the Upper Galil, but there it is, not far from Beit Shemesh. And suddenly we see, rising out of just next to this moshav, we see this fortress.
A fortress.
But it's a fort. I mean, it's so clearly. And the funny thing was, we drive up to it, and it looked like it had been. It's like one of these, it looked like it should be a national park. Here in Israel, it's very expensive to get into these things, or relatively expensive, because once something becomes formalized, they get national park. Each person needs to pay, a certain amount to get in, and it can get expensive. We drove in, and there was like this, looked like there was a place where they were preparing to put this national park office and ticket office, but there was nothing there.
It wasn't open officially
yet. It wasn't open, and yet they walked around, and they had these signs everywhere, helpfully saying this is what things were. And that was the beginning of our encounter, we went back many times.
I want you to
Lachish.
describe, because it's very important over here, the size of the fortress.
Yes. So let me describe what you're seeing over here. You park the car, you see a fortress. What do I mean by this? You can see it's not just this kind of like castle thing. It's called a tell. A tell is an archaeological hill. It is clearly a sizable town, a fortified town. And this town, we could just talk through what you're seeing first. What you're seeing first, you don't even know what you're seeing first, because you see this kind of like a hill that is partially covered with like earth, meaning it looks like a hill. And you can see there's fortifications rising from the top, but you don't see, a lot of those fortifications are covered. And the reason is, what you're not aware of is that you're seeing the siege works that the Babylonians created to encase the walls of this town and literally to invade it.
Yeah,
That's what you're seeing.
It's a double encasing, because what I found out last night was that the besiegers, right, the ones who were coming from outside, they were piling up dirt on one side, right? And those who were inside were throwing torches on them from the top and rocks and boulders. But when they realized that nothing was working, they themselves started to build a mound of themselves in order to fight them panim el panim.
So you mean they had to build it
double,
as
right?
higher?
Exactly.
So which means effectively
right?
it's a bit confusing. And in this mound, apparently, although it's not something, I suppose if you started grubbing around in the dirt, you'd find it yourself. But in this mound, what is apparently there, they found hundreds or possibly thousands of arrowheads that were from Sancheriv. I make a mistake. It was not from Babylonian times. It was from 700 CE, which is the time of Sancheriv. They found Assyrian, Ashur arrowheads.
Just for the benefit of our listeners, okay?
Yeah.
We have to understand that you're going to be talking about this at length, but you have to understand that like the capture of Lachish and then Yerushalayim came like in two stages. One, 100 years before the other one. The first one was Sancheriv, which managed to capture Lachish and did not manage to capture Yerushalayim, as we know from the Nevi'im. And then Bavel comes in their steps 100 years later, recaptures Lachish and manages to capture. But it's the same route. It's exactly the same route.
And the route is very important. We're going to get to that. So let's just walk up together. If you imagine you see this big wall, next to this wall, you're starting immediately an ascent ramp. The ramp would have been the same back in the day because you had to get up into the city. You're climbing up and you're walking up next to the walls of the city and you come to a gate. And when I say a gate, I don't mean that you can see the crossbar or the gateway. You can see posts on either side with a wall. But what is so impressive about this, as the signage points out over there, is that you see what we talk about in Yom Kippur every day on Shabbos. We talk about the Dayone Dibova, the Dayanim of the gate. Now, how do you sit inside a gate? How many Dayanim can get
We know
into
that from an earlier source. We know that from Bayaz,
Right.
Shar Ha'ir.
With Shara.
Right,
We
the
know from an
skating from Shara,
earlier
right.
source because who is it? I was thinking that Avram to the Bnei Ches Elchol
Right.
Boy Sha'ira. It was the Shar Ha'ir business we know in ancient times. The gateway was in some way constructed that lots of business could go on. The judges should sit there. There was going to be the Dayanim sitting there. The business, whatever. And there you see one, because this is what it is. A gateway is a double gateway. What it is you go into one, and then there's a large area, I don't know, quite a few square meters, a big area, okay? And then there's a right-hand turn, and you're in the second gate. So since the whole area is encased.
They're rooms.
Yeah.
They're not like just like an open gate. You have a complete room.
Correct.
Like inside that complex of the gate.
That is first of all, one of the things that I learned, walked away from then is say, hey, I really understand that you can understand. This is what it is. But when you get to the top, I think there's a palace of one of the Malchi who was there. I forget which one it was.
Amatzia, I think.
But it says
it was earlier than that.
Amatzia was killed. We know that Amatzia
ran away from Yerushalayim.
Ran away from Yerushalayim to there, and he was assassinated there.
Right.
So I don't know whether it was his palace, but it was for hundreds of years a fortress of the Malchi Yehuda. Now the important reason is, as soon as you get beyond the gate, look out of the view, and you'll understand why they put a fortress there. What is it? Because you look all the way down to the west, I suppose it is, and you see all the way to Gaza. Now, what is important about Gaza? We think, well, there's Hamas in Gaza, etc. Yeah, Gaza's always been a problematic place. Gaza was the base of the Pelishtim, okay? So if you are already from the time of David HaMelech, he has to deal with Gaza and its cities, Ekron, Gas, the others, which are encroaching, and the Pelishtim always want to encroach all the way to Yerushalayim. So the fortress is there to block them, because once you control those highlands of the Shvela, of the highlands of the lowlands, you therefore dominate the route. You physically block the way into Lachish.
But that's only one direction. On the other direction
Yep.
is the direction towards Yerushalayim. So you have like this fortress which is controlling the entire place we call in Tanakh zones Medinas Yehuda. And that is a beautiful country. If you stand on top of that fortress over there, it's like you described about the vineyards, right? It's all like lush greenery.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful, that's the heart of Eretz Yisrael, Maisa.
And I would add, hold on, you're looking one way towards Gaza and also all the Philistine, the Pelishti cities that would have constantly tried to encroach towards it, and the other way towards Yerushalayim. I'll ask you to look a bit further towards Gaza, because if you look south from Gaza, meaning if you look in the same southwest direction, what are you looking at? Egypt. Now, Egypt, we think that we had to take some Mitzrayim, we forget them, and the only thing that Egypt could possibly get is some horses or cotton or whatever it is. That's not the case. The case is that Egypt remained a regional power. They're always trying to get up. For Egypt, they've either got two directions. If Egypt wants to exercise its power, it can either go deeper south into Africa, into Kush and all these different places. But if they want to get out, they have to come through what we call Gaza, and then they can either continue up the coast of the Levantine coast, all the way up the coast of Eretz Yisrael, past Tel Aviv, past Haifa, past Nahariya,
Or go to Yerushalayim and
to
up
Yerushalayim.
the Bik'ah until the...
That's right.
Till the Golan.
To the Golan, and cross over into Syria, and then from there Iraq, Iran, Jordan, what are all these places?
So this is actually like, I don't know, it's a gateway or a pathway from Mitzrayim to the main kingdoms of Ashur and Bavel.
And so what actually happens, we're going to see, is, interestingly, whichever direction you come from, if you're coming from Gaza, coming from Egypt, that certainly have to go through this route. But in other times, whether it's Bavel or whether it's Ashur before it, who are coming to tackle this fortress, what do they want with this fortress? The answer is they've come down the Levantine coast. They've come from what's called Lebanon, and they're trying to get to Egypt, and once they get down the coast, they suddenly say, hey, what about Yerushalayim? We're going to swing back inland. And they're blocking their route as Lachish. And that is what you can see just standing on top of it.
Just to get the dimensions of the palace, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how it works out in American measurements or in English measurements, but we're talking about the palace itself was 3 dunams, and it's surrounded by a chutzner of 12 dunams. And what I understood is the majority of the city of Lachish was the palace and its courtyard. I mean, that took up like the majority of the rest was like the minority area of the
So in other
city.
words, what we're saying there is very simply that it was a royal fortress with
Exactly.
perhaps some dwellings of, the soldiery, the garrison would have needed to be there. But it's by no means a city with a fortified city.
Right, it's not Yerushalayim, Bekitzer.
Yeah. For most of the history, I think, of Bayis Rishon, there was one overwhelming fact of life that we are perhaps not aware of. And that of going to the geopolitics of it, Rabbi Ephraim, which is Ashur rule the world. And we have all bits of fragments in our mind. I think Ashur lo yoshienu and Ashur this, and I think probably we can talk about, maybe we can pull out of our hat, there was who's the kings of Ashur, and there was...
More importantly, halachically, we till today, I don't know if you can suffering, but with our halachic results from the fact that Ashur ruled the world, because the Gemara tells us that Bas Sancheir of Bilbilis Ha'olam,
Sancheir mixed up.
In order to prevent
moved around nations.
Revolts, what did he do? He replaced nations from the places of birth, right?
Including the one from here. That's what he did. He moved the goddess of Am Yisrael from here.
Right.
It was
and he transported people into Eretz Yisrael and from different lands.
And the people he put here were who?
The Kutim were part of them.
And they were
that's where it all started,
converts,
right?
I think.
Right, even though today the Shomonim will be very insulted if you say that they come from those Kutim, but that's what we believe halachically. The logic behind that is that a person will revolt in order to save his homeland.
But you mean if he's anyway a guest, he's going to be much more quiescent.
Exactly. So
do you know, by the way, there's a parallel to this. Do you know who did this? Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin in the 30s, one of his approaches, he moved millions of people around, places.
Just a
he
fact.
took Koreans. Do you know they ruled Korea? Right? He took Koreans and he put them in Kazakhstan.
Wow.
And he took Kazakhstanis and put them in crazy places. And he created this sense nobody belonged, nobody had any roots anywhere. So as you say, how could you...
Why should I fight for
why
this?
did I fight? I'm not going to fight against it. In other words, it just sent everyone crazy, and they couldn't.
So this
there's no
has
roots anymore.
halachic ramifications.
Meaning?
Because we cannot. If you ask a question today, is why don't we have a chiyuv today of zayin armamin, like to destroy the
seven nations,
the Canaanim, right? Or the din of Amalek. All these things all come as a result of the fact that we cannot determine on any single person anywhere
which people were native.
Exactly. Who comes from Canaan,
so that
who comes from Amalek.
So that was, but as you say, it's very insightful that, because what we see from Chazal is, by the way, an imperial strategy. What is Sancheriv doing? Sancheriv is conquering, forming an empire, and the way he exerts his control is by, as you say, moving people around. But we perhaps don't realize what a powerful empire it was. So who is Sancheriv and his empire? Sancheriv is one of the last powerful rulers of Ashur. And where was it based? So it's a familiar name, but perhaps we don't associate it. It was Nineveh, based in Nineveh. So go and tell the people of Nineveh, Yonah Navi, to go to repent. And we always think, I don't know, Nineveh, who knows where that is? Nineveh is a city on the banks of the Tigris River in modern-day Iraq. That's where it is. And the most amazing thing is to see the pictures of the very rich carvings on the walls of that palace, which talk about destroying and attacking Yehuda.
Lachish. It's specifically Lachish. And it was transported from Nineveh to London, I think.
All over the place, actually. And luckily so. And were it not for European colonialism, it would have been I was looking around and I found that from an article back in 2016, when the ISIS, do you remember Daesh? Right. ISIS, the Islamic State, were busy blowing up priceless antiquities, statues and things that stood for thousands of years. And this all blew up even handily, casually. A bit of that palace there, including something priceless, absolutely priceless, is not possible to replace. But the point is that...
what's very interesting is some scholars claim that the reason why he made such a deal out of commemorating the capture of Lachish was because he couldn't capture Yerushalayim.
Makes a lot of sense.
He wanted to prove, like...
He had to come away with something.
Exactly, right. So imagine Donald Trump, after losing, quote unquote, the war with Iran, he has to come up with something. Right?
You mean it's a piece of propaganda to tell a story of victory when really it was a story of defeat.
It's fascinating that it really is a piece of propaganda, because there's a plaque on top of it which describes what you're seeing. You don't leave it to guessing.
Right.
It just says these.
So the diplomats visiting the imperial
plaque
capital.
From his time, not from our time. The plaque is from Sancheriv's
time.
So
it wasn't in a museum. This was something that every visiting diplomat would have had to see and going back to report. He would have reported the magnificence of Nineveh and of Sancheriv, but he also would have said, and this is a king. This is a king who's conquered this, and I saw this, and I conquered that, and he conquered the other. And these reliefs, they're called, where they're the carvings, they tell a story, as you say.
What's fascinating is that we can see from those drawings how the battle went, like what the Jews were using in order to battle them, what kind of techniques. And you can find the types of plants that grew in that area. Everything is very detailed in that.
Well, listen, it was a one of a kind. This was the ruler of the ancient world, employing the most, I suppose, the most advanced forms of artists to develop and commemorate his victories, and as you say, to tell a story. But all that came to an end because the empire of Ashur had ruled for over a century. All the way. We have to understand, it was a world power. Let's just understand. It ruled all the way from Egypt to the Persian Gulf. That means if what we would call the entire Near and Middle East, and beyond as well. So remember that this is the cradle of civilization back then. You can forget America, you can forget most of what's going in Europe, you can forget everything. This is the center of the world, and he rules all of it. But part of that, he, at some stage, as you see in the Sefer Malachim base, Ashur is encroaching deeper and deeper into the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Mamleches Yisrael, which is based in Shomron, and eventually it's under the 19th king of the northern kingdom. His name is Hoshea ben Elah, who was a vassal of Ashur. It is captured, and it says, Olav Ola Shalmaneser melech Ashur va'ile asher eved va'yeshiv lo minchas. We know that Shalmaneser was the one before Sancheriv. Shalmaneser came, and then there's a siege. Va'al Shomer, he captured it after 3 years, and then under Sancheriv they're exiled. The northern kingdom is exiled, and Mamlechas Yisrael is gone. And that's what we know already. Aser Sashvatim, they go. And then what happens, Arab Ephraim, is very natural. Because if you are the king of Ashur, what do you say? Okay, I've got the northern kingdom, keep going down south. And it's described in Sefer Melachim, Ba'arba Eser Shana LaMelech Chizkiyahu. What's a very important thing? Just, and talk about halt and kop, just holding. The difficulty of Sefer Melachim is to follow the two tracks of Malchi Yisrael and Malchi Yehuda happening simultaneously. But it says in the 14th year of the king Chizkiyahu, Ola Sancheriv Melech Ashur al Kol Or Yehuda Habetzuros Vayitbasem. And Sancheriv attacks the southern kingdom, conquers all of the fortified cities, and he takes them. And so what do we see over there, Rabbi Ephraim? That Sancheriv he's not going for Yerushalayim first. His strategy is he's not going to attack the head first. He's going to attack the outlying limbs, and one of them is none other, Rabbi Ephraim, than Lachish. When Chizkiyahu Melech seeks terms with the Assyrians, so he's trying to appease them. He's the king of Yerushalayim, but all his outlying fortified cities swallowed up. He doesn't send a message to Nineveh. We find the Pasuk says very clearly, Vayishlach Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda Melech Ashur Lachisha. He sends it to Lachish. What does that tell you? That tells you that by that stage, Lachish has become an important forward operating base, they'd call it.
Stronghold. It's a stronghold of Ashur.
Of Ashur inside
Eretz
Yisrael. And you find other psukim describe the same thing. We have that when Rav Shoke, who was one of the 3 generals, I think, it would have been of Sancheriv in Eretz Yisrael, conducting the Sancheriv's assault on Yerushalayim, he says, Vayishlach melech Ashur min Lachish ela melech Chizkiyahu b'cheil koved Yerushalayim. And he sends the jumping off point it's used in the modern parlance and in military terms is from Lachish itself. And that status of Lachish, as Rabbi Ephraim, as you said before, is commemorated on the walls in Sancheriv's palace. Where, as you said before, it reads, Sancheriv, king of the world, king of Assyria, sat upon his throne and reviewed the booty of Lachish. But actually, what actually happened there was things didn't go to plan. Because having conquered all the Ori Betzuris, all the fortified cities of Yehuda, conquered Lachish, they're using it as an operating base, etc. What happens? He fails to take Yerushalayim.
That is a fact historically, because, as you said before, the fact that he commemorates the capture of Lachish and not of Yerushalayim proves that he did not conquer Yerushalayim, because no one in his right mind would think that Lachish is more important than Yerushalayim. So if he did conquer Yerushalayim, he would have mentioned it. Now, according to our Nevi'im, we know that a miracle happened which blocked him from entering Yerushalayim.
Which is interesting, that not for the first time, a dictator didn't report on his defeats.
But we can derive it from the fact that he didn't commemorate his victory.
Correct. So he was forced, as the account over there, he had to go back for other reasons first to his capital Nineveh, and at the time it was because he apparently had brothers who was not so clear that he had to look after his throne. Remember, it's 1,500 miles back to Nineveh, and he has a kingdom there, and his brothers may not be so loyal to him, and he had to go back. When he comes back, that seems to have been when the miracle happens. 185,000 of his soldiers.
I want to point out that
killed.
Anyone going to visit the Kaisel, who walks through the old city, when he walks down that famous alley that everyone goes to buy ice cream, right? Walking down from the Churva to the Kaisel, right?
From the square there.
From the square of the Churva down to the steps that go down to the Kaisel. If you take a left turn after, I think, the ice cream stores, right? You take a left turn, and you look downwards, and you'll see a massive piece of a wall.
Yeah.
That's called Chizkiyahu's wall. That was the wall that he created in order to block off Sancheriv. And if you see how wide that wall is...
Many meters and meters thick. It is. You're talking about it's on the far side of this where the Churva Shul is. You go past the Churva Shul, and instead of going across to down to the coast, you turn left.
Turn left in one of the alleyways.
Correct.
On the way
the first
to the left.
alleyway there. Yes.
Yeah, you can see it. It's like bordered.
It's an amazing sight. It's an amazing sight because you see.
But you have to realize what you're seeing.
Correct. Right. And that's the context over here. This is Chizkiah Melech, and for this reason. Sancheriv took a strategy. He would have taken one look at those walls and said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to isolate Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is a very tough nut to crack on its own. I'm going to isolate it by cutting itself off and conquering the rest of his kingdom and force Chizkiah to his knees. And in fact, what Chizkiah was able to do was to make terms with Sancheriv and he lost his army as well. And he retreated, having promised to pay tribute and to be some type of subject to
allow me to interject with something halachic.
Yeah.
That wall that we're talking about has a halachic significance until today. And that it is a halacha which is called Meiser Sheni.
Yep.
And that is that you have to give a tenth of produce every few years, not every year. It's the first, second, fourth, and fifth year of counting from Shemitah.
And in between is Meiser Oni.
Right. The third and the sixth is Meiser Oni. But Meiser Sheni, the halacha of Meiser Sheni is that the tenth of the produce has to be eaten inside Yerushalayim.
Mm-hmm.
But the Torah tells us that you can redeem the money and bring the money to Yerushalayim and eat the with foods in Yerushalayim. The problem is that fruit that entered Yerushalayim does not have that heter of redeeming the fruit unto money. Okay? So today, till this day, you cannot redeem fruit that entered Yerushalayim. Now, what is Yerushalayim?
Mm-hmm.
So I saw the Rav of the Churva has a very interesting, Rav Zilberman has a very interesting article about this halacha, and he uses this wall.
And he says what within this wall is definitely Yerushalayim.
Right.
Because you can see it's the old wall.
It's not the Sultan's walls.
Correct,
that
which
we
is
see
the modern walls of Yerushalayim are just from the
Right. They had no halachic
Ottomans
significance, right?
Right. So he's saying this we know for certain. So if you're in the Churva, you mean you're definitely in halachic Yerushalayim. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. The empire that destroyed Mamlechet Yisrael, nearly destroyed Mamlechet Yehuda, obviously disappeared itself. Almost a century after Sancheriv, Ephraim, his capital Nineveh falls in 612 BCE. So remember that just the timing, Sancheriv is coming about 700. 612, almost a century later, Nineveh falls, captured by the Babylonians.
And that becomes the major empire of the world.
For me, this is where the story of the Churban takes off, because all of that was a long wind-up to explain the significance of Ashur. But the story of the Churban is really the story of three empires. And let me just explain like this. The story of the Churban is the story of when the empire of Ashur was weakening and fading. As we see, its capital was captured in 612. It's the story, the second moving part in that story is of Egypt under Paranechoi, which we're about to see. Egypt, as a regional and world empire at some stages, is getting nervous, okay? And when you're a nervous thing, why? Because the third empire, Babylonia under Nevuchsdnezzar rising. What does a nervous empire on one side do about a rising empire on the other? When there's a third dying empire in the middle, it says, let's try and hold up that third empire, what we'd call a buffer zone, a buffer state. That is exactly what happens over here. Because as Ashur disappears, what happens is the old enemy, Egypt, was conquered and ruled by Ashur for a long time. But Egypt itself is now more worried about Bavel. So it says, let's keep this tottering old giant a bit on its feet to protect us. And that's what happens over there. Because that's the context of one of the great tragedies of Ephraim. Was one of the great tragedies which we say on Tisha B'Av. We hear Vayikoinen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu. Yirmiyahu Hanavi said his elegy, Kino, for King Yoshiyahu, King Josiah. And what happens over here?
Who was a righteous tzaddik, right? It's a righteous king.
A tremendous, what does he say? Asher omarnu betziloi nichgeh bagoyim. That's what they said. In his tzidkus, perhaps he will be able to stave off the impending threat of these empires. And it worked for a stage. Now, what's the basic story of King Yoshiyahu? Yoshiyahu Melech was...
He was commanded by the Navi not to go out to war.
With Paranechoi, yeah.
And he disregards that, and he He confesses on his deathbed after he's shot by many arrows.
Pierced by many, correct. Like it says,
right.
like a sieve they made him.
Right. He didn't listen to the warning of the Navi.
But why did he, again, what was it said? He said, I'm not going to listen to the Navi because he said, there's a Pasuk says clearly, when the Klal Yisrael are on the right Madrega, the Cherev loisava ba'artzachem, no sword will pass through your land. Afilu Cherev shel shalom, even a sword of peace. Now I have to remember that Paroi over Egypt, Paro's Egypt was an ally of Yehuda. So why was he standing in the way? He's saying because it's a Pasuk. And the Navi said to him, no, you don't understand that Klal Yisrael, look, in your days, you brought them all to great tshuva. He abolished the Avodah Zarah, and he himself, the story of Yoshio, was he only discovered the Torah later, much later in life, and it was an incredible thing. He didn't know what the Sefer Torah was. And he led a wave of tshuva. But what was happening is, as we read, if you open your art scroll Machzah, your art scroll Kinnis and Tisha B'Av, you said that behind the doors they had
they hid Avodah Zarah.
Hid Avodah Zarah, split into two, and when you put the doors together, Rabbi Ephraim, I don't know if I always imagine this from when I read this as a kid. I always imagine this as like, you know, like an old Western, they have like the saloon bar, where like the saloon bar doors to come together. So that was what happened there, like the saloon bar doors, and the Avodah Zarah split in two. And so when Yoshio's inspectors came to see whether there was Avodah Zarah, I said, no, it's clean, look at our shas, look at our shas, look at everything. And when you put it together, there was the widescreen TV, you know, that was what it was.
What's very interesting is that in Lachish, we spoke about Lachish before, we see remnants of Hiskiyo's fight against Avodah Zarah as well. They found their altars. It could be that it was Bamais that were outside Yerushalayim, and that's also an Isser. Besides Bamais for Avodah Zarah, Bamais to be Makriv Korbanos outside Yerushalayim is also an Isser. So they found that the corners were like rubbed off. That's one of the things that they found in Lachish. And the other thing that they found
rubbed off meaning smashed in that way? What a bummer needs to have like square corners, like tefillin.
Like a mizbeach. Like a
mizbeach. So if you rub it off, then
right.
If you rub it off, then it disqualifies.
Right. And the most fascinating thing is that they found inside the place where the holy of holiest of those places, they found a bathroom.
Really?
You see a stone that has a hole in it.
Was that Baal Pa'or?
And the archaeologists say that they placed a bathroom there in order to make sure that this room will not be used.
Oh, I see.
Sacrifice.
It was a way of expressing
and
contempt.
And they say it's from the times of Chizkiyo. The archaeologists say it's from the time of Chizkiyo.
Right. Just fascinating that. So
if we ever go visit there, we should look out for that.
Definitely have to do that. So what happens is that in that time, Yoshio is killed as he stands up to Paranechoi. And the battle at a place called Megiddo, right? And there's some at Megiddo, which is people, if you travel up north, you're going to see there's Megiddo Junction. And there he dies. What happens, one of the greatest kings in Jewish history falls in the middle of a struggle between empires. Because whilst we in the Kinnis always think about it, the fact that, you know, Eit Yuam Hakesav Azov Yishna whatever it says, Tishta Peichna Avnei Kodesh Barosh Kol Chutzos. The Eicha is full of that. Part of it is talking about Yoshio's death. We also have to remember that there was who was on the other side. Where was Paranechoi going? He was simply wanted to go across Eretz Yisrael to go to aid the Ashurim. Assyria is being conquered
to fight
over there.
Bavel.
To fight Bavel because he's scared of Bavel and he's trying to prop up Assyria over there. And so what happens after Yoshio Melech dies? So who's the king? So you know what happens? Paris says, that's it. Judea, the kingdom of Judah, of Yehuda, has now passed from the column of ally into the column of enemy, and therefore it's a vassal state. I'm going to install my man in it. So what it says, Vayasreu Paranechoi berivla be'eretz chamos melech b'Yerushalayim. Paro takes a son of Yoshio, doesn't like that one. He puts another son of Yoshua in power, a son called Eliakim. He renames him Yehoiakim, right? We know, what is the act of renaming someone? It says, Vayamleich Paranechoi Eliakim ben Yoshio, Vayasev Shmo Yehoiakim. He changed his name. When you change your name, he's saying, you're my boy, right? You only exist as king. That's the significance of it, in my behest. And so what happens over there is the kingdom of Yehuda is for just 4 years, into the Mamleches Yudas, under the Egyptian sphere of influence. And why only 4 years? Rabbi Ephraim Zamagalinsky, why only 4 years? Because what happens is that Paroi, having killed Yoshiyahu, installed a puppet. He's marching to defend Ashur. He comes to battle with the Babylonians on the Euphrates, on the Har Paras, at a place called Carchemish, okay? And in a gigantic battle in 605 BCE, he loses. Remember what's happened? He's attempting to maintain his buffer zone. Let's just get the chronology over here. The Assyrian capital Nineveh falls in 612. So the Assyrians say, okay, Nineveh's gone. It was totally destroyed, left behind a few bits of plaster work in the palace like we saw. They moved their capital, to a place called Choron, which sounds very familiar because it is familiar, right? From Avraham Avinu, Terach from Choron. And Choron is captured in 609, and the Assyrians need to flee to another place, Carchemish. And there, Nevuchsdnezzar manages to draw them, to bring them to battle. And he defeats Paranachoi. And the end result of that thing is that Egypt is finished as an empire. How do we know? Because Yirmiyahu Novi in Perek Mem Vav says the following it's like a geopolitical earthquake of a pasuk. He says, L'Mitzrayim. This is a prophecy about Mitzrayim, actually. Al Chel Paro Nechoi Melech Mitzrayim. He's prophesying about the army of Paro Nechoi. Hashahel Nahar Paras Becharkemish. Hashahikon Nevuchsdnezzar Melech Bavel. B'shnas Liyokim and Yoshua Melech Yehuda. And the end result is, as we say in Sefer Melachim Beis Chaf Daled, it's an unbelievable thing. Never again did Paranachoi was able to leave, in a military sense, to project power beyond his land. Ki lokach melech Bavel minach Mitzrayim ad nachal Paras kol asher hoya lemelech Mitzrayim.
He left him enclosed in his own Daladamas.
Well, what word is Daladamas, actually?
Beyond Nachal Mitzrayim, which is beyond either El Arish or the Nile.
Right. So in other words, he can't. Now, I think, if I'm not mistaken, what happens is the completion of that is that Nevuchsdnezzar, in other words, remember, he's based on the Euphrates. That's where his base, that's where his power is. And he's taken the whole of the Assyrian, the Ashur Empire, all the way through Iraq, Iran, and all the way across Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey as well, because that's where he's taken that power, all the way down to what we call the Levantine Sea, the coast of Eretz Yisrael. He's taken it all the way to El Arish or Nachal Mitzrayim, and he tries to go beyond that, but he's repulsed.
But he did continue his conquers, not through Mitzrayim, but towards Yerushalayim, through the route of Lachish, as we explained before, from Aza, which is the Plishtim, to Lachish, to Yerushalayim. That's the route.
So he swings back into Lachish, which brings us right back to the fortress. So we return to Azekah and to Lachish, and to the fact that extraordinarily strategic position, as you say, of this fortress guarding the approaches to Yerushalayim.
This is like the second round of fighting. The first round was Ashur against Chizkiyahu, and now we are Nevuchsdnezzar and Bavel against the last remaining king of Yerushalayim.
And as the pasuk, as we began with, says, the pasuk in Yirmiyah says, "Ve'el tzva melech Bavel nilchomim al Yerushalayim." The Babylonians are approaching, trying to fight for Yerushalayim. Ve'al kol ori Yehuda noisaros. There's only two fortified cities left of Yehuda, Lachish and Azekah. Ki hine nisharu me'ori Bavel ori mivsa. Only these fortresses remain. And that brings us to this wonderfully poetic letter that the fires have gone out of Azekah.
So I didn't want to ruin your enthusiasm when you mentioned it in the beginning, but I want to point out that
you're about to ruin it.
Right. There is someone who, at a certain period in his life, also dabbled in politics. His name is Dr. Benny Begin. Whoever doesn't know who it is.
Son of former Prime Minister Menachem Begin.
He didn't do well in the Likud, as we know. Right? At a certain point, he just left. He picked himself up and left.
Maybe the skepticism which we're about to see was too much for the voters. I think that's what happened.
Right. So he says that this letter that you read in the beginning was not like one of the fine letters before the Churban, but a random report of one of the guards of Lachish saying that he can't see the fires of Azekah. It had nothing to do with the Churban or anything like that. But there's no doubt that the letter comes from the times of Bais Rishon, like the writing and the context and the pottery. That's a given. The question is this one of the letters that was right before the Churban?
And by the way, it's all too easy to draw the links. Here we have a pasuk in Yirmiyah saying the last two cities were Lachish and Azekah, and here it is. And that was before the Churban, immediately before, because once you captured this, the Nebuchadnezzar moved on Yerushalayim. And here he's saying we can't find Azekah, so it's confirmation
You're right.
bias.
There's no doubt that this letter confirms, or not saying confirm, but it's parallel to what we have in the Tanakh, that Azekah and Lachish are the main.
I can well imagine how a researcher is going to find this is so compelling as I do to tell the story and say this is what it is. But as you say, skepticism is in order. But let's just back up a minute and just understand what was actually on these letters themselves. They were written between an officer called Hosheyahu and his commander of Lachish called Yosh. It seems to have been Yud Aleph Vav Shin. And it's just basic housekeeping.
Oh, by the way, in one of the letters, he's very insulted that someone accused him of not reading the letter properly. Like he was like a bit illiterate.
That's why they are so human. They're literally
authentic.
They're authentic. You're reading the guy's notebook. It's his text messages. You know what I'm saying? Like, he got angry here. In one letter, he asked for provisions, some loaves of bread and jugs of wine. And he also discusses, obviously, troop movements. And then he has, as you say, this irritated defense of his own literacy. And then there's also a reference to the morale, actually. He says, Divrei hasorim enum tovim, l'rapois es yedei anoshim. The words of the officers are causing sort of low morale amongst the troops. And then you have this line that we've belabored already. We can't see Azekah, everything else. Whether it is or whether it isn't, that particular smoking gun of the last stage for the Churban, Rabbi Ephraim, I just want to say why I found this so. I said at the beginning of the episode, when I went up to Lachish for the first time, it was a Friday morning, and I sent a message to my father, who was, I think, was about 9 o'clock over here, and so it must have been about 7 o'clock in England. My father is, and I said, am I right in saying that we have a family history connection to this place? He said, what are you talking about? Lachish. I said there was something in the back of my mind, and he sent me back. He says, of course, my father's grandfather, Professor Shlomo Osher Birnbaum, son of Dr. Nathan Nosson Birnbaum, the famous Baal Tshuva, who was the subject of a couple of episodes at the beginning of this series, was a expert in Hebrew paleography, which is to identify the age of script. He was an expert in Yiddish and also ancient Hebrew. And he was involved actually in discussing, in dating some of the correspondence here, because handwriting and letters, the oises change over time. And he was able to say,
that's how you can identify any written document, like from what Kufa it came from.
Correct. He was actually
each Kufa had its unique.
Correct, and he was involved in dating the Dead Sea Scrolls because of that as well. And so when I was standing there, it is this jumped out. Finally, I said, "Oh wow, this is where those shards came from." There were also seals from the king. They found these hundreds, and the fortresses around Lachish. There's quite a few fortresses. Around Lachish is Tel Socho, which is opposite Ramat Beit Shemesh Gimel. There is Tel Azekah, which we said was destroyed, which is again nearby. There are multiple fortresses around, and they have in them hundreds of these seals, which are called, in English, they're called LMLK seals, because LMLK spells out Lemelech, right? And this was Chizkiah Melech's seal. The seals have in them like an Egyptian symbol, a scarab, like a beetle. And that beetle symbol was extremely common. It was an Egyptian device, which goes to show that was Egyptian influence over it. And you can see, therefore, Malchus Yehuda being a balance between these two different powers. I want to end with just one thing. We've talked about Lachish. We've talked about a lot about its walls, okay? I want to end with talking about the walls of a city of Bovel itself, those who conquered Lachish, those who conquered afterwards Yerushalayim, and just because there's last little remarkable fragments from Sefer Yirmiyah. Sefer Yirmiyah, as I said, I think what we're seeing from this episode, the Yirmiyah, it's possible to see the Nevi'im and to read in them and to understand the all-important context, to understand that they are actually not just talking about, they're talking about very specific items or trends or personalities that existed in their world. And even in fragments of words, a few words here and there, they're referring to things. And one of the things that struck me when preparing this episode was the descriptions of Bovel. Now, we know that Bovel was a magnificent city. We don't have time in this episode there to explain exactly what there was we can see of it, but
the
one
falling
thing
gardens,
or the hanging gardens of Babylon, which is never unclear. This is one of the unclear things. Archaeologists have never located these things, But what is interesting is that Yirmiyahu Hanavi refers to Bavel as Shochenes al Mayim Rabim, she who dwells on many waters. Now, that would have made perfect sense to those who knew that the capital city of the world's superpower was based in a city that was on the Euphrates River, and in fact had this ingenious irrigation system where they, something like these Archimedes screws that we know that take that from the ancient world, bring irrigation water up from a river. And the city, the ancient historians describe it as being so much water. It was like you inside the city, there was like it was cool and there's water everywhere. And that was because, as Yirmiyahu just describes it in a few words, as Shechenas Amayim Rabim. I think that's really beautiful to compare. But there's another thing as well, which is that we know that the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who describes that the walls of Bavel were so thick, so wide, that they could be that two chariots, each drawn by 4 horses, could go past each other on top of the wall without touching each other. And Yirmiyahu Hanavi himself describes this in a few words. In the end of Yirmiyahu Nun Aleph, he says, Choimas Bavel Harachava. And we know that when they found it, eventually excavated it, they found that the cities 120 years ago, they found that the walls of Bavel itself were something like 17 meters thick itself.
If you allow me to just end off from my perspective, in the University of Berlin, they discovered receipts of the prison guards of Bavel, where they're reporting to the commanders the expenses that they have to feed the prisoners. And one of the prisoners that they talk about there is Yochanan and his family. And we know that from Tanakh, that Bavel and Nevuchsdnezzar reinstituted a king in Yerushalayim called Tzidkiyahu, but took Yochanan to captivity, him and his family, and they were the only ones that survived from Machlus Beis David. And we found the receipts of the guards reporting that this is the money that we need in order to feed. It says in Tanakh that a Yoshev al Shulchanai ad Sofi Mechayev. This is found in the receipts in the prison of the palace of Bavel.
Something you triggered there, a little thought process, because I know there's almost like a cottage industry about how we find the days of Shavuos B'Tammuz, particularly and Tisha B'Av, particularly difficult, because we have to connect to these days when 24 hours, it's not our world. It's very hard to connect. Well, isn't it remarkable that out of the many, there's not much left over of many of the empires, that we have very little about them. But on these empires, the ones that destroyed us, we see that the Churban Bayis Rishon, whether it's from Nineveh all the way to Bavel, or the Churban Bayis Sheni, there are strong remnants left over, because perhaps Loi Alman Yisrael, as I think Yirmiyahu says, and this is something that we can appreciate if we look at these findings up close.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Gedalia.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Behind the Times. We appreciate you joining us as we explore the stories and people that shape Jewish history. If you enjoy this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with friends. Until next time.